He was not supposed to be there. James Whitfield arrived at the Meridian Tower 47 minutes before anyone expected him, before the morning staff, before his assistant, before the security rotation had finished its handover log, and he stepped out of the elevator on the 32nd floor into a hallway that was supposed to be empty. It was not empty. She was on her knees in the corridor outside the glass conference room, both hands pressed flat against her thighs, her cleaning cart pushed to one side, and she was crying. Not dramatically, not loudly. The kind of crying that has learned to be quiet. The kind that has been practiced so many times it no longer asks for anything from the room it happens in. Her shoulders moved once. Her head was bowed. One hand came up and pressed against her mouth, and she held herself there, completely still, the way you hold yourself when you are trying not to let a sound escape into a world that has no room for it. James stood at the elevator threshold for 3 full seconds. Then the doors began to close behind him, and he stepped forward, because there was nowhere else to go. She heard him. She was on her feet before he had taken 3 steps, smoothly, without scrambling, without the red-faced apology he had anticipated, and she turned and met his eyes directly and said, "Good morning, Miss Whitfield. You're very early today." Her voice was level. Her hands moved to the handle of the cleaning cart, as if she had simply been adjusting something near the floor. James said nothing for a moment. In 22 years of running Whitfield Property Group, 4 commercial towers, 2 luxury residential buildings, a construction division that employed 300 people, he had never walked in on something like this and not known what to say. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "Yes, sir," she said. "Of course." She turned to the conference room door and began to unlock it. He told himself it was nothing. People had hard mornings. He had more important things to think about. He walked toward his office at the end of the hall and told himself he would not think about it again. He thought about it for the next 9 days. James Whitfield had built the Meridian Tower at 41. He was 53 now, and there were photographs of the building on every wall of his office, aerial shots, ground-level shots, a framed architectural rendering from the year the project was approved, a photograph from the day they poured the foundation that showed a much younger man in a hard hat grinning at a camera like a person who did not yet know what the next decade would ask of him. His wife Catherine had chosen the frames. She had also chosen the lamp on the credenza, the blue rug, the painting of the Yorkshire coast that she said reminded her of the first holiday they had ever taken together, a rented cottage in Whitby, August. It rained every day. They had considered it the best week of their lives. Catherine had been dead for 14 months. He did not move anything she had placed in that office. He worked around her choices the way you work around the furniture, in a room you have not yet decided what to do with. His colleagues had stopped mentioning it. His children, Edward, who was 26 and lived in Edinburgh, and Clara, who was 23 and had recently moved back to London, had stopped suggesting he redecorate. People who loved him had learned to interpret the photographs on the walls and the lamp on the credenza and the Yorkshire coast above the filing cabinet as architectural details rather than grief, because that was the interpretation he had made available to them. His assistant Priya had learned, in the months since the funeral, to read the particular quality of his silences, to distinguish the thinking silence from the grief silence, the one that descended without warning and lasted until he decided it was over. She had also learned not to ask questions unless he asked them first. It was Derek Holt, the building operations manager, who had not learned this. Derek Holt managed the contracted cleaning staff, the maintenance schedules, the supply chains, the security rotation. He was 44, competent at the visible parts of his job, and consistently present in James's office with information James had not requested. had been this way for 2 years. James had interpreted it as diligence. "I wanted to flag something before you saw it in the system report," Derek said, on the morning of the 10th day after James had watched Margaret cry in the hallway. James looked up. One of the cleaning staff on 32. Margaret, a sigh. She's been going missing from her assigned floors. 20, sometimes 25 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. The floor log shows the rooms left unfinished and then finished later, but the gap is consistent, always between 6 and 7 in the morning. Derek set a printed sheet on the desk. "I had building security run the card access data. She's not going to any other floor during that time. She badges out through the service exit and comes back. Every time." James looked at the sheet. "Has anyone spoken to her? I wanted to bring it to you first. There's also this." Derek set a second sheet beside the first. "Supply inventory discrepancies on 32. Cleaning products. Antiseptic, gauze pads. We keep a first aid stock in the service corridor. Small amounts. But it matches her shifts." James sat back. He thought about her hands on her thighs, her shoulders moving once. "Speak to her," he said. "Formally, today." Margaret Osai had worked the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower for 3 years and 4 months. She had never been late. She had never broken anything. She had never raised her voice. The other cleaning staff on the morning rotation, Victor, who worked 30 through 31, and Sylvia, who handled the lobby, knew her as the woman who kept a small photograph tucked inside the folded cloth on her cart, and who sometimes brought boiled eggs in a container and left them in the service corridor for whoever got there first. She was 40 years old. She had been a cleaner in this building since 4 months after her husband Daniel died. Derek Holt called her into the facilities office at 7:45. He had asked Victor to be present as a witness, and the building's head of security, a man named Gerald, who had worked in the Meridian Tower for 11 years, and who watched this meeting with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen a great many things in facilities offices. "I'll come straight to the point," Derek said. "The floor logs show you've been leaving your assigned area multiple times per week without authorization. The supply records show discrepancies that correspond with your shifts." He folded his hands on the desk. "I need an explanation." Margaret stood with her hands clasped in front of her. She was wearing her uniform, gray, pressed, a small name badge at the collar. She looked at Derek and said nothing for a moment. "I understand why it looks the way it looks," she said. "That's not an explanation, Margaret, no," she said. "It isn't. Can you tell me where you're going during those windows?" She was quiet again. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. The kind of quiet that is deciding something. "No," she said. "I can't explain it right now. But I haven't taken anything from this building that I didn't intend to account for." Derek looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the middle distance. "That isn't a satisfactory answer," Derek said. "I'm going to have to escalate this to Mr. Whitfield, I understand," Margaret said. She did not wring her hands. She did not cry. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin level, and looked at Derek Holt with an expression Gerald would describe later to his wife as a person who already knew how the story ended and had decided to let it finish in its own time. James heard the summary from Derek at 9 o'clock. She had no explanation. She acknowledged the absences. She refused to account for the supplies. "I'll speak to her myself," James said. He called her to his office at 10. She came alone. She sat in the chair across from his desk with her hands in her lap and looked at him the way she had looked at him in the corridor, directly, without aggression, without the sliding glance of someone composing a story. "Margaret," he said, I need you to tell me what's happening." "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I know how this looks. Tell me what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face, not weakness. Something more complicated than weakness. "I can't tell you right now," she said. "I will be able to tell you. But not today. That's not acceptable." "I know," she said. "I know it isn't. And I know what that means." She paused. "But I'm asking you to give me a little time. Not much time. 3 days. He felt the frustration of it, the blankness of no explanation, the tidiness of Derek's printed sheets, the supply discrepancies, the floor logs. And underneath the frustration, something else. The memory of her shoulders moving once in a quiet corridor. "I can't justify that to my operations team," he said. "You understand." "Yes," she said. "I do. I'm going to have to put you on suspension pending investigation." She nodded. Once, she looked directly at him and said, "You've been watching me disappear for 3 weeks, Mr. Whitfield. I've been watching this building disappear for 3 years." Neither of us said a word. He did not know what to say to that. She stood, thanked him for his time, and left. He sat at his desk for a long time. He looked at the photograph of the Yorkshire coast. He looked at the lamp Catherine had chosen. He called Priya and told her to hold his morning calls. He told himself he was doing it to protect the company. He told himself that a suspended employee with an unexplained pattern of behavior was a liability, that he needed to understand what he was dealing with before the investigation proceeded. He told himself these things while he sat in his car in the basement car park and waited. At 5:58 in the morning, 3 days into her suspension, a day before her formal review, he watched Margaret Osai come through the service entrance on foot from the street, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. She did not enter the building. She turned left and walked north along the service road at the back of the tower. He followed her. He told himself it was due diligence. He drove slowly, staying 2 blocks back, watching her small figure move through streets he had never driven down slowly before, streets he had seen from above, from 32 floors, where they were a grid of gray and light, not this particular sequence of shop fronts and early buses, and a man with a fruit cart who called out to her as she passed, and she raised one hand in acknowledgement. Without breaking her stride, she walked for 22 minutes. The neighborhood changed the way water changes temperature, gradually, then all at once. The streets near the tower were wide and had been recently resurfaced, the pavements clean, the signage consistent. Then a bridge, and on the other side the surface became older, patched in places with asphalt that was a slightly different shade, the way a scar sits against the skin around it. The buildings lost their brickwork and became pebble dash. The pebble dash became board-patched render. A laundromat with a handwritten card in the window. A mini-mart with a metal shutter half raised. A hair salon not yet open, its lights still off. A child's drawing taped inside the glass where an advertisement might otherwise have been. The gardens, where there were gardens, held things that had been left rather than placed. A rusted bicycle frame propped against a gate it would never again open. 3 plastic chairs arranged around a cable drum being used as a table. A mattress wrapped in bin bags against the wall, waiting for a collection that was either coming on Friday or had already come and gone without it. The street signs were present, but had not been repainted in a long time, and one of them pointed toward a road that did not appear to exist anymore, replaced by a fence, and beyond the fence what had once been a demolition site and was now simply an absence the neighborhood had learned to route around. James was aware, in the specific way of a man whose professional life consisted of evaluating built environments, of the gap between what he knew this kind of neighborhood cost on paper and what it actually cost to exist inside one. He had seen these streets in planning documents. He had seen them in feasibility studies and infrastructure assessments. He had not seen them from inside a car going 4 miles an hour with the heater off because he had forgotten to turn it on. The pavement ended without warning and became packed earth, and then became pavement again 4 houses down, as if the road had simply forgotten itself for a moment. James parked the car. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and looked at the street. He had driven past the edges of places like this without stopping. He had never stopped. He got out. He could see her half a block ahead, turning into a path between 2 houses, a passage so narrow the hedges on either side touched above it. He followed on foot. The hedges were wet from the night's damp and brushed cold water onto the shoulders of his coat, and he did not stop to register the discomfort because he was watching where she was going. Through the passage and out the other side into a small yard. At the far end of the yard, a house. The description that came to him was not a word he would have chosen, but it was the only accurate one. Exhausted. The house had the specific exhaustion of a building that had been holding itself together through sheer stubbornness for years. The window frame soft at the corners with old paint. The guttering slightly detached on the left side and braced back in place with what appeared to be wire. The front door freshly painted. He registered this specifically. Freshly painted. A blue that was careful and deliberate. A blue that cost something and had been chosen with care. There was a gap in the hedge at the side of the house where the wire fence had bent outward over time. He stood behind the hedge. The light inside was warm. One lamp in the window, low, amber. He heard her before he saw her. The door opened. The sound reached him first, a rush of small voices and the particular acoustic of a small house with wooden floors. And then one voice above the others, a boy's voice, 7 or 8 years old, saying with enormous relief, "Mum, you're home. You're actually home." Not performing the words, meaning them with his whole body, the way children mean things when they do not know yet how to mean them less. James stood absolutely still. Through the gap in the fence he could see a portion of the kitchen. Warm yellow walls. A table. 3 children. The oldest perhaps 10. A girl. The middle one, the boy who had spoken, and a smaller one he couldn't fully see. Margaret was on her knees with her arms around the older 2, and the youngest had climbed onto her back like a barnacle and was pressing his face against her neck. She was laughing. He had not heard her laugh before. It was different from her work voice. It was low and full and unguarded in the way of something that didn't know it was being observed. She drew back and looked at the children and said, "Let me see you. All of you. Let me see." She was touching the older girl's forehead, feeling for temperature. James understood, though he could not have said how he knew. The girl had the particular stillness of a child accustomed to being examined for fever. "Emma's better," the boy said. "The medicine's working. I did it right, I measured it exactly." "I know you did," Margaret said. "I know. We've got enough for 4 more days," the girl said. Oliver checked. "I'll get more tomorrow," Margaret said. She was still holding Emma's face in both hands. "You're sure you feel better?" "Much better," Emma said. "The cough is less." James looked at the canvas bag Margaret had set down inside the door. He could see the shape of it, the clean right angles of boxes, a bottle, the specific geometry of things carefully packed. He had seen those shapes before. In the supply inventory report, he knew the brand of the antiseptic because it was the brand stocked in the Meridian Tower's service corridors. He understood then what she had been taking, and what she had been taking it for. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stood in the cold behind the hedge, and tried to process this information in the way that he processed all information. Methodically, linearly, one fact arriving after another, and found that he could not do it. His mind kept arriving at the same image, her on her knees in the corridor on the 32nd floor, shoulders moving once, hand pressed to her mouth. He had seen her holding herself together in that hallway and told himself it was nothing. He heard the boy's voice again from inside the house, lower now. Sitting down at the table, the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting on a day. "Mum," Oliver said, "does Daddy know we're okay? Does he know from heaven that you still clean his building?" The kitchen went quiet. James felt the question land somewhere below his sternum, in a place that had no name and no professional classification, and stay there. "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice did not waver. "He knows. Mrs. Dawson at school said heaven is everywhere," Emma said. "So he can see everything from everywhere. Then he can see that you measured the medicine exactly right," Margaret said. "And that you looked after your sister. He can see all of that." James walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and put his hands flat on the steering wheel and did not start the engine. His hands were shaking. Not trembling, shaking, in the specific way of a person who has just had something large removed from them without warning, and their body has not yet adjusted to the absence. He looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. He had not cried at the funeral. He had stood at the graveside and held Edward and Clara's shoulders and not cried, and people had mistaken this for strength, and he had let them. He sat in the car for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he was looking at the clock and could not look away from it. Then he started the engine and drove back. He called Priya from the road and told her to pull the personnel file for Margaret Osai. All of it. Everything there was. He read the file that morning in his office with the door closed. Margaret Osai. Employed as contracted cleaning staff, Meridian Tower, 3 years and 4 months. Start date, 16 weeks after the death of her husband Daniel Osai, who had been employed as a senior site laborer on the Meridian East Development Project. The residential tower James had broken ground on 18 months before the current building, and who had died on site after a scaffolding failure on a section that had been signed off as compliant by the site safety inspector. James sat with this information for a very long time. The site safety inspector on the Meridian East development had been Derek Holt. He called Gerald at Building Security and asked him to pull 3 months of Derek Holt's supply room access logs, his purchasing records, and his site sign-off reports. He asked this calmly and without explanation. Gerald, who had spent 11 years learning when to ask questions and when not to, said he would have them within the hour. He had them in 40 minutes. The falsified sign-offs were not subtle. They were the work of a man who had been confident for a long time that no one was looking. 3 structural compliance reports submitted under Derek Holt's authorization, altered. James could see the version history in the digital files, the amendments made the day before submission, the original assessments that had noted serious deficiencies in the scaffolding certification. Daniel Osai had died on a section of site that Derek Holt had approved as safe when he had known it was not safe. And 3 years later, when a pattern of missing inventory began appearing in the Meridian Tower, cleaning supplies going unaccounted for, the wife of the man who had died on his previous site taking small amounts of medical supplies home to 3 children with no health insurance. Derek Holt had brought it to James Whitfield's office in 2 tidy printed sheets, and James had suspended her. James called his solicitor. Then, he called the company's head of legal. Then he called Gerald back and asked him to ensure Derek Holt did not leave the building. It happened in the lobby. James had asked Gerald to bring Derek down from the facilities office at 11:15. He had asked Priya to call Margaret and tell her she was needed back in the building. He had asked Sylvia to ensure the lobby was staffed, the full morning cleaning team, the front desk, the security rotation. He had asked this without explaining why, and people had come because James Whitfield asking was generally sufficient. Derek came out of the elevator expecting a private conversation. James was standing in the center of the lobby with Gerald on one side of him and the company's solicitor on the other, and every person who worked in that building and happened to be present that morning arranged in the ordinary way they arranged themselves in a lobby, except that they were all present, and they were all watching. "Derek," James said, "I've reviewed the Meridian East safety documentation." Derek's face changed. It was not a subtle change. "The scaffold compliance reports," James said. "Your amendments, the original assessments, all of it." He paused. "I know what you did, and I know why you brought me the reports on Margaret Osai. The lobby was quiet in the way lobbies are not usually quiet. The ambient sound of the city pressing against the glass from outside, and inside, nothing. You brought me those reports," James said, "because you knew who she was. You knew whose wife she was. And when the inventory flags came up, you saw a way to redirect 3 years of your own exposure onto a woman whose husband died because you signed off a site you knew was not safe." Derek said. "James, Mr. Whitfield," James said. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. "You will not call me James." Gerald stepped forward. The solicitor placed a document on the front desk. Derek Holt left the Meridian Tower lobby in the company of 2 people who were not his friends, and every person present watched him go. And no one said anything for a moment after the doors closed behind him. Then Sylvia, who had worked the Meridian lobby for 6 years, and who was not a person who made speeches, said very quietly to no one in particular, "Good," and went back to her mop. Margaret arrived at 11:30. She came through the service entrance as she always did, in her uniform, because Priya had not told her why she was needed, only that Mr. Whitfield had asked for her. She walked to the lobby and stopped when she saw it. The full staff, James standing in the center, Gerald to his left, the solicitor with papers. James walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her, at the woman who had stood in his office and said she could not explain herself, and accepted suspension rather than say something it was not the right time to say, and he found that the words he had prepared were not the words that came out. "I know about Daniel," he said. She went very still. "I know what he was doing on that site. I know what Derek Holt signed off on. I know why you started working here." He paused. "I know about the children." Her expression did not break, but something in it shifted, like a wall that has been holding pressure for a long time finally finding a foundation on the other side. "Your suspension is lifted," he said, immediately, formally, in writing. He nodded toward the solicitor. "And I owe you an apology. I believed what I was given without asking what I was not given. That was my failure." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not the only one who lost someone they believed in," she said. Quietly, not cruelly, as a fact. He said, "No, I'm not." The lobby was very quiet. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said. "A real one, not a gesture. We're establishing an employee welfare and safety division. I need someone who understands what it costs when a company fails the people who keep it running. I'd like that person to be you, if you'll take it." He paused. "The starting salary and the contract are in those papers. Look at them before you decide. You don't owe me an answer today." She looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. "Ask me again in a week," she said, "when I've had time to think clearly." "All right," he said. "And Mr. Whitfield," she said. Yes, Emma's fever broke yesterday. Oliver measured the medicine exactly right. He said, I know. Her eyes asked the question before she did. I was there, he said. I followed you. I'm not proud of it. But I was there. She looked at him for a very long time. And then something happened in her face that was not quite forgiveness and was not quite its absence. Something more patient than either. Something that had decided to let time do the work that words could not do quickly. Then you know, she said. Yes, he said. I know. 3 months later, on a Tuesday evening in November, there was a small gathering on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower. Margaret was there, and Oliver and Emma and the youngest, Samuel, who was 4, and had decided that the lobby elevator was the greatest invention in the history of human achievement, and needed to press the buttons himself. Gerald was there, and Sylvia, and Victor, and Priya, who had brought her husband, and spent the evening in the warm, specific way of someone who had been waiting for this evening for a long time. James was there. His children, Edward and Clara, had come from their respective lives and stood by the window looking out at the city with their father standing between them, his hands on their shoulders. On the wall of the conference room that looked out over the construction quarter of the city, the quarter where Meridian East had been built, where a scaffold had failed, where a man named Daniel Osai had not come home, there was a new plaque. It read, the Daniel Osai Memorial Safety Fund, providing health insurance, legal protection, and educational support for the families of all contracted workers across Whitfield Property Group. Because the people who build these towers deserve towers of their own. Established November 2024. Oliver stood in front of it for a long time. He read it twice. Then he turned to James and said, in the direct way of a child who has already decided something and is simply informing you of it, my dad would have liked you. James said, I hope so. Emma pulled at Margaret's sleeve and said, can we see the window where you work? And Margaret took her to the glass and pointed out the landmarks below, the park, the river, the construction lights of a new building going up on the eastern side, and Samuel pressed his face against the glass and said the word wow 17 times in a row, each time as if it were happening for the first time. Priya had brought a cake. Nobody had asked her to. It said nothing on it except a date, and that was enough. At a certain point in the evening, after the food and the quiet conversation and the children running the length of the corridor because Gerald had told them they could, and nobody had contradicted him, James went to stand by the window alone for a moment. The city laid itself out below him in the darkness and the light, the grid of streets, the river bending south, the construction crane standing patient and still in the November air. He became aware of something. The candle on the conference table, Priya had brought it, unlit, and someone had lit it at some point in the evening. Its flame bent, without reason, toward the door. The window was closed. There was no draught in the room. The flame bent, held its direction for 3 seconds, and then steadied. James watched it for a moment. Then he turned back to the room, to Oliver and Emma and Samuel, to Gerald's quiet smile, and Sylvia's unsentimental nod, and Priya's careful warmth, to Edward and Clara at the window, to Margaret standing with all 3 of her children in the amber light of a Tuesday evening in November, in the building where she had held herself together for 3 years and 4 months, without making a sound anyone thought to listen for. He picked up a glass from the table. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches easily, and the room was too full of the right kind of quiet for a speech to improve it. He simply raised his glass, briefly, toward the plaque on the wall. And everyone in the room understood. If you have ever gone quietly about your work in a place that did not know your name or the weight of what you were carrying, If you have ever folded yourself small to fit inside someone else's idea of who you were allowed to be, if you have ever stood in a hallway and pressed your hand over your mouth and refused to let the sound out because the world had not yet made room for it, this story was always about you. It was always for you. And what Margaret Osai understood, in that building, on that floor, in that 3 years and 4 months of early mornings and pressed uniforms and quiet cartwheels and small photographs kept inside folded cloth, is something that does not require a title or a plaque or a man in a good suit to finally become true. Dignity is not something they give you when they are ready. It is something you carry in your hands every single morning, all the way from home.